Lesson clips. High-quality lessons in bite-sized form. The Boxer Rebellion, Boxer Uprising, or Yihe Tuan movement was an anti-imperialist, anti-foreign, and anti-Christian uprising in China between 1899 and 1901 toward the end of the Qing dynasty. It was initiated by the Militia United in Righteousness, or the Yihe Quan, known in English as the Boxers because many of their members had practiced Chinese martial arts, also referred to in the Western world at the time as Chinese boxing. Villagers in North China had been building resentment against Christian missionaries who ignored tax obligations and abused their extraterritorial rights to protect their congregants against lawsuits. The immediate background of the uprising included severe drought and disruption by the growth of foreign spheres of influence after the Sino-Japanese War of 1895. After several months of growing violence and murder in Shandong and the North China Plain against foreign and Christian presence, in June 1900, Boxer fighters, convinced they were invulnerable to foreign weapons, converged on Beijing with the slogan, "Support the Qing government and exterminate the foreigners." Foreigners and Chinese Christians sought refuge in the Legation Quarter. In response to reports of an invasion by the Eight-Nation Alliance of American, Austro-Hungarian, British, French, German, Italian, Japanese, and Russian troops to lift the siege, the initially hesitant Empress Dowager Cixi supported the Boxers, and on June 21st issued an imperial decree declaring war on the foreign powers. Diplomats, foreign civilians, and soldiers, as well as Chinese Christians in the Legation Quarter, were besieged for 55 days by the Imperial Army of China and the Boxers. Chinese officialdom was split between those supporting the Boxers and those favoring conciliation, led by Prince King. The supreme commander of the Chinese forces, the Manchu general Rong Lu, or Yung Lu, later claimed that he acted to protect the foreigners. Officials in the Mutual Protection of Southeast China ignored the imperial order to fight against the foreigners. The Eight-Nation Alliance, after being initially turned back, brought 20,000 armed troops to China, defeated the imperial army, and arrived at Peking on August 14th, relieving the siege of the legations. Uncontrolled plunder of the capital and the surrounding countryside ensued, along with a summary execution of those suspected of being Boxers. The Boxer Protocol of 7 September 1901 provided for the execution of government officials who had supported the Boxers, provisions for foreign troops to be stationed in Beijing, and 450 million taels of silver, approximately $10 billion at 2018 silver prices, and more than the government's annual tax revenue, to be paid as indemnity over the course of the next 39 years to the 8 nations involved. Historical background. The origins of the Boxers. The Righteous and Harmonious Fists, or the Yihe Quan, arose in the inland sections of the northern coastal province of Shandong, long known for social unrest, religious sects, and martial societies. American Christian missionaries were probably the first to refer to the well-trained athletic young men as Boxers, because of the martial arts and weapons training they practiced. Their primary practice was a type of spiritual possession which involved the whirling of swords, violent prostrations, and chanting incantations to deities. The opportunities to fight back Western encroachment and colonization were especially attractive to unemployed village men, many of whom were teenagers. The tradition of possession and invulnerability went back several hundred years, but took on special meaning against the powerful new weapons of the West. The Boxers, armed with rifles and swords, claimed supernatural invulnerability toward blows of cannons, rifle shots, and knife attacks. Furthermore, the Boxer groups popularly claimed that millions of soldiers would descend out of heaven to assist them in purifying China of foreign oppression. In 1895, despite ambivalence toward their heterodox practices, Yu Xian, a Manchu who was then prefect of Kaohsiung, would later become provincial governor, cooperated with the Big Sword Society, whose original purpose was protection against banditry to fight bandits. The missionaries of the German Society of the Divine World had built up their presence in the area, partially by taking in a significant proportion of converts who were, quote, in need of protection from the law. On one occasion in 1895, a large bandit gang, defeated by the Big Sword Society, claimed to be Catholics to avoid prosecution. The line between Christians and bandits had become increasingly indistinct, remarks a recent historian. Some missionaries, such as George Stenz, also used their privileges to intervene in lawsuits. The Big Swords responded by attacking Catholic properties and burning them. As a result of diplomatic pressure in the capital, Yu Xian executed several Big Sword leaders, but did not punish anyone else. More martial secret societies started emerging after this. The early years saw a variety of village activities, not a broad movement with a united purpose. Martial folk religious societies such as the Baguado, 8 trigrams, prepared the way for the Boxers. Like the Red Boxing School or the Plum Flowers Boxers, the Boxers of Shandong were more concerned with the traditional social and moral values, such as filial piety, than with foreign influences. One leader, Xu Hongdang, the Red Lantern Jew, started as a wandering healer specializing in skin ulcers and gained wide respect by refusing payment for his treatments. Xu claimed descent from Ming Dynasty emperors since his surname was the surname of the Ming imperial family. He announced that his goal was to revive the king and destroy the foreigners. The enemy was foreign influence. They decided that the quote, primary evils were the Christian missionaries and the secondary evils were the Christian converts to Christianity. Both had to recant or be driven out and killed. Causes of the conflict and unrest. The combination of extreme weather conditions, Western attempts at colonizing China, and growing anti-imperialist sentiment fueled the movement. First, a drought followed by floods in Shandong province in 1897 to 1898 forced farmers to flee cities and seek food. As one observer said, "I'm convinced that a few days' heavy rainfall to terminate the long-continued drought would do more to restore tranquility than any measures which either the Chinese government or foreign governments can take." A major cause of the discontent in northern China was missionary activity. The Treaty of Tientsin, or Tianjin, and the Convention of Peking, signed in 1860 after the Second Opium War, had granted foreign missionaries the freedom to preach anywhere in China and to buy land on which to build churches. On 1st November 1897, a band of armed men, who were perhaps members of the Big Sword Society, stormed the residence of a German missionary from the Society of the Divine World and killed 2 priests. This attack is known as the Yue Incident. When Kaiser Wilhelm II received news of these murders, he dispatched the German East Asia Squadron to occupy Shashou Bay on the southern coast of the Shandong Peninsula. In December 1897, Wilhelm II declared his intent to seize territory in China, which triggered a, quote, scramble for concessions by which Britain, France, Russia, and Japan also secured their own sphere of influence in China. Germany gained exclusive control of developmental loans, mining, and railway ownership in Shandong province. Russia gained influence of all territory north of the Great Wall, plus the previous tax exemption for trade in Mongolia and Xinjiang. Economic power similar to Germany's over Fengtian, Jilin, and Heilongjiang provinces. France gained influence over Yunnan, most of Guangxi and Guangdong provinces, Japan over Fujian province, and Britain gained control over the whole Yangtze River Valley, defined as all provinces adjoining the Yangtze River as well as Henan and Xinjiang provinces, parts of Guangdong and Guangxi provinces, and a part of Tibet. Only Italy's request for Xinjiang province was declined by the Chinese government. These do not include the lease and concession territories where foreign powers had full authority. The Russian government militarily occupied the zone, imposed their law and schools, seized mining and logging privileges, settled their citizens, and even established their municipal administration on several cities, the latter without Chinese consent. On October 1898, a group of Boxers attacked the Christian community of Liyuntun village, where a temple to the Jade Emperor had been converted into a Catholic church. Disputes had surrounded the church since 1869, when the temple had been granted to the Christian residents of the village. The incident marked the first time the Boxers used the slogan, "Support the king, destroy the foreigners," that later characterized them. The Boxers called themselves the Militia United in Righteousness, for the first time 1 year later at the Battle of Sanliu Temple in October 1899, a clash between Boxers and King government troops. By using the word militia rather than Boxers, they distanced themselves from forbidden martial arts sects and tried to give their movement the legitimacy of a group that defended orthodoxy. Aggression toward missionaries and Christians drew the ire of foreign, mainly European governments. In 1899, the French minister in Beijing helped the missionaries obtain an edict granting official status to every order in the Roman Catholic hierarchy, enabling local priests to support their people in legal or family disputes and bypass the local officials. After the German government took over Shandong, many Chinese feared that the foreign missionaries and possibly all Christian activities were imperialist attempts at carving the melon, i.e. to colonize China piece by piece. A Chinese official expressed animosity toward foreigners succinctly, quote, "Take away your missionaries and your opium, and you will be welcome." The early growth of the Boxer movement coincided with the 100 Days Reform in September 1898. in which progressive Chinese officials, with support from Protestant missionaries, persuaded the Guangxu emperor to institute sweeping reforms. This alienated many conservative officials whose opposition led Empress Dowager Cixi to intervene and reverse the reforms. The failure of the reform movement disillusioned many educated Chinese and thus further weakened the Qing government. The empress seized power and placed the reformist emperor under house arrest. The national crisis was widely considered as caused by foreign aggression. Foreign powers had defeated China in several wars, forced a right to promote Christianity, and imposed unequal treaties under which foreigners and foreign companies in China were accorded special privileges, extraterritorial rights, and immunities from Chinese law, causing resentment among the Chinese. France, Japan, Russia, and Germany carved out spheres of influence so that by 1900 it appeared that China would be dismembered, with foreign powers each ruling a part of the country. Thus, by 1900, the Qing dynasty, which had ruled China for more than 2 centuries, was crumbling, and Chinese culture was under assault by the powerful and unfamiliar religions and secular cultures. Boxer War, intensifying crisis. In 1900, with a majority of conservatives in the imperial court, Empress Dowager Cixi changed her position on the Boxers and issued edicts in their defense, causing protests from foreign powers. In spring 1900, the Boxer movement spread rapidly north from Shandong into the countryside near Beijing. Boxers burned Christian churches, killed Chinese Christians, and intimidated Chinese officials who stood in their way. American Minister Edwin H. Conger cabled Washington, quote, "The whole country is swarming with hungry, discontented, hopeless idlers." On 30th May, the diplomats, led by British Minister Claude Maxwell MacDonald, requested that foreign soldiers come to Beijing to defend the legations. The Chinese government reluctantly acquiesced, and the next day a multinational force of 435 Navy troops from 8 countries debarked from warships and traveled by train to from Dagu to Beijing. They set up defensive perimeters around their respective missions. On 5th June 1900, the railway line to Tianjin was cut by Boxers in the countryside, and Beijing was isolated. On 11th June, the Yongding Gate, the secretary of the Japanese legation, Sugiyama Akira, was attacked and killed by the soldiers of General Dong Fuxiang, who were guarding the southern part of the Beijing walled city. Armed with Mauser rifles but wearing traditional uniforms, Dong's troops had threatened the foreign legations in the fall of 1898, soon after arriving in Beijing, so much so that the United States Marine Corps had been called to Beijing to guard the legations. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II was so alarmed by the Chinese Muslim troops that he requested the Caliph Abdul Hamid II of the Ottoman Empire to find a way to stop the Muslim troops from fighting. The Caliph agreed to the Kaiser's request and sent Enver Pasha, not to be confused with the future Young Turk leader, to China in 1901, but the rebellion was over by that time. Also on 11th June, the first Boxer, dressed in his finery, was seen in the legation quarter. The German minister Clemens von Kettler and German soldiers captured a Boxer boy and inexplicably executed him. In response, thousands of Boxers burst into the walled city of Beijing that afternoon and burned many of the Christian churches and cathedrals in the city, burning some victims alive. American and British missionaries had taken refuge in the Methodist mission, and an attack there was repulsed by American Marines. The soldiers at the British embassy and German legations shot and killed several Boxers, alienating the Chinese population of the city and nudging the Qing government towards support of the Boxers. The Muslim Gansu braves and Boxers, along with other Chinese, then attacked and killed Chinese Christians around the legations in revenge for foreign attacks on the Chinese. Seymour Expedition. As the situation grew more violent, a second multinational force of 2,000 sailors and marines, under the command of British Vice Admiral Edward Seymour, the largest contingent being British, was dispatched from Dagu to Beijing on 10th June 1900. The troops were transported by train from Dagu to Tianjin, with the agreement of the Chinese government, but the railway between the Tianjin and Beijing had been severed. Seymour resolved to move forward and repair the railway, or progress on foot if necessary, keeping in mind that the distance between Tianjin and Beijing was only 120 kilometers. When Seymour left Tianjin and started toward Beijing, it angered the imperial court. As a result, the pro-Boxer Manchu Prince Duan became leader of the Zhongli Yamen Foreign Office, replacing Prince King. Prince Duan was a member of the imperial Asian Goro clan, foreigners called him a blood royal, and Empress Dowager Cixi had named her son as next in line for the imperial throne. He became the effective leader of the Boxers and was extremely anti-foreigner. He soon ordered the Qing Imperial Army to attack the foreign forces. Confused by conflicting orders from Beijing, General Ni Shixiang let Seymour's army pass by in their trains. After leaving Tianjin, the convoy quickly reached Langfang, but found the railway there to be destroyed. Seymour's engineers tried to repair the line, but the Allied army found itself surrounded, as the railway, both behind and in front of them, had been destroyed. They were attacked from all parts by Chinese irregulars and the Chinese governmental troops. 5,000 Dong Fusheng Gansu braves and an unknown number of Boxers won a costly but major victory over Seymour's troops at the Battle of Langfang on 18th June. As the Allied European army retreated from Langfang, they were constantly fired upon by cavalry, and artillery bombarded their positions. It was reported that the Chinese artillery was superior to the European artillery, since the Europeans did not bother to bring along much for the campaign, thinking they could easily sweep through Chinese resistance. The Europeans could not locate the Chinese artillery, which was raining shells upon their positions. Mining, engineering, flooding, and simultaneous attacks were employed by Chinese troops. The Chinese also employed pincer movements, ambushes, and sniper tactics with some success against the foreigners. News arrived on 18th June regarding the attacks on foreign legations. Seymour decided to continue advancing, this time along the Baihe River toward Tongshao, 25 kilometers or 16 miles from Beijing. By the 19th, they had to abandon their efforts due to progressively stiffening resistance and started to retreat southward along the river with over 200 wounded. Commandeering 4 civilian Chinese junks along the river, they loaded all their wounded and remaining supplies onto them and pulled them along with the ropes from the riverbanks. By this point, they were very low on food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Unexpectedly, they then happened upon the Great Jeju Arsenal, a hidden Qing munitions cache, of which the Allied powers had no knowledge until then. They immediately captured and occupied it, discovering not only Krupp field guns, but rifles with millions of rounds of ammunition, along with millions of pounds of rice and ample medical supplies. There they dug in and awaited rescue. A Chinese servant was able to infiltrate through the Boxer and Qing lines, informing the 8 powers of the Seymour troops' predicament. Surrounded and attacked nearly around the clock by Qing troops and Boxers, they were at the point of being overrun. On 25th June, a regiment composed of 1,800 men, 900 Russian troops from Port Arthur, 500 British seamen, and an ad hoc mix of other assorted alliance troops, finally arrived on foot from Tientsin to rescue Seymour. Spiking the mounted field guns and setting fire to any munitions that they could not take, an estimated £3 million worth, Seymour and his force and the rescue mission marched back to Tientsin, unopposed on 26th June. Seymour's casualties during the expedition were 62 killed and 228 wounded. Conflicting attitudes within the Qing imperial court. Meanwhile, in Beijing, on 16th June, Empress Dowager Cixi summoned the imperial court for a mass audience and addressed the choices between using the Boxers to evict the foreigners from the city or seeking a diplomatic solution. In response to a high official who doubted the efficacy of the Boxers, Cixi replied, "Both sides of the debate at the imperial court realized that popular support for the Boxers in the countryside was almost universal, and that suppression would be both difficult and unpopular, especially when foreign troops were on the march. Two factions were inactive during this debate. On one side were anti-foreigners who viewed foreigners as invasive and imperialistic, and evoked a nativist populism. They advocated taking advantage of the Boxers to achieve the expulsion of foreign troops and foreign influences. The pro-foreigners, on the other hand, advanced rapprochement with foreign governments, seeing the Boxers as superstitious and ignorant. The event that tilted the Qing imperial government irrevocably toward support of the Boxers in the war with the foreign powers was the attack of foreign navies on the Dagu forts near Tianjin on 17th June 1900. Siege of the Beijing legations. On 15th June, Qing imperial forces deployed electric mines in the river Baihe, or Paiho, to prevent the 8-nation alliance from sending ships to attack. With a difficult military situation in Tianjin, and a total breakdown of communications between Tianjin and Beijing, the Allied nations took steps to reinforce their military presence significantly. On 17th June, they took the Dagu forts, commanding the approaches to Tianjin, and from there brought increasing numbers of troops on shore. When Cixi received an ultimatum demanding that China surrender total control over all its military, and financial affairs to foreigners, she defiantly stated before the entire Grand Council, "Now they, the powers, have started the aggression, and the extinction of our nation is imminent. If we just fold our arms and yield to them, I would have no face to see our ancestors after death. If we must perish, why don't we fight to the death?" It was at this point that Shishi began to blockade the legations with the armies of the Peking Field Force, which began the siege. Shishi stated that, quote, "I have always been of the opinion that the Allied armies have been permitted to escape too easily in 1860. Only a united effort was then necessary to have given China the victory. Today at last the opportunity for revenge has come," and said that millions of Chinese would join the cause of fighting for the foreigners since the Manchus had provided great benefits on China. On receipt of the news of the attack on the Dagu forts on 19th June, Empress Dowager Cixi immediately sent an order to the legations that the diplomats and other foreigners depart Beijing under escort of the Chinese army within 24 hours. The next morning, diplomats from the besieged legations met to discuss the Empress's offer. The majority quickly agreed that they could not trust the Chinese army. Fearing that they would be killed, they agreed to refuse the Empress's demands. The German imperial envoy, Baron Clemens Freiherr von Ketteler, was infuriated with the actions of the Chinese army troops, and determined to take his complaints to the royal court. Against the advice of the fellow foreigners, the Baron left the legations with a single aide and a team of porters to carry his sedan chair. On his way to the palace, von Ketteler was killed on the streets of Beijing by a Manchu captain. His aide managed to escape the attack and carried word of the Baron's death back to the diplomatic compound. At this news, the other diplomats feared that they also would be murdered if they left the legation quarter, and they chose to continue to defy the Chinese order to depart Beijing. The legations were hurriedly fortified. Most of the foreign civilians, which included a large number of missionaries and businessmen, took refuge in the British legation, the largest of the diplomatic compounds. Chinese Christians were primarily housed in the adjacent palace, Fu, of Prince Su, who was forced to abandon his property by the foreign soldiers. On 21st June, Empress Dowager Cixi declared war against all foreign powers. Regional governors who commanded substantial modernized armies, such as Li Hongshang at Canton, Yuan Shikai in Shandong, Shang Shidong at Wuhan, and Liu Kunyi at Nanjing, refused to join the imperial court's declaration of war, and withheld knowledge of it from the public in the south. Yuan Shikai used his own forces to suppress the Boxers in Shandong, and Shang entered into negotiations with the foreigners in Shanghai to keep his army out of the conflict. The neutrality of these provincial and regional governors left the majority of the Chinese out of the conflict. They were called the Mutual Protection of Southeast China. The legations of the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Austria-Hungary, Spain, Belgium, the Netherlands, the United States, Russia, and Japan were located in the Beijing Legation Quarter, south of the Forbidden City. The Chinese army and Boxer irregulars besieged the Legation Quarter from 20th June to 14th August 1900. A total of 473 civilians, 409 soldiers, marines, and sailors from 8 countries, and about 3,000 Chinese Christians took refuge there. Under the command of the British Minister to China, Claude Maxwell MacDonald, the legation staff and military guards defended the compound with small arms, 3 machine guns, and 1 old muzzle-loaded cannon, which was nicknamed the International Gun, because the barrel was British, the carriage Italian, the shells Russian, and the crew American. Chinese Christians in the legations led the foreigners to the cannon, and it proved important in the defense. Also under siege in Beijing was the northern cathedral, Bitang, of the Catholic Church. The Bitang was defended by 43 French and Italian soldiers, 33 Catholic foreign priests and nuns, and about 3,200 Chinese Catholics. The defenders suffered heavy casualties, especially from lack of food and mines, which the Chinese exploded in tunnels dug beneath the compound. The number of Chinese soldiers and Boxers besieging the legation quarter in Bitang is unknown. On 22nd and 23rd June, Chinese soldiers and Boxers set fire to areas north and west of the British legation, using it as a, quote, frightening tactic to attack the defenders. The nearby Hanlin Academy, a complex of courtyards and buildings that housed, quote, the quintessence of Chinese scholarship, the oldest and richest library in the world, caught fire. Each side blamed the other for the destruction of the invaluable books it contained. After the failure to burn out the foreigners, the Chinese army adopted an anaconda-like strategy. The Chinese built barricades surrounding the legation quarter and advanced brick by brick, on the foreign lines, forcing the foreign legation guards to retreat a few feet at a time. This tactic was especially used in the Fu, defended by Japanese and Italian sailors and soldiers, and inhabited by most of the Chinese Christians. Fusillades of bullets, artillery, and firecrackers were directed against the legations from almost every night, but did little damage. Sniper fire took its toll among the foreign defenders. Despite their numerical advantage, the Chinese did not attempt a direct assault on the legation quarter, although in the words of one of the besieged, quote, "It would have been easy by a strong, swift movement on the part of numerous Chinese troops to have annihilated the whole body of foreigners in an hour." American missionary Frank Gamewell and his crew of fighting parsons fortified the legation quarter, but impressed Chinese Christians to do most of the physical labor of building defenses. The German and Americans occupied perhaps the most crucial of all defensive positions, the Tartar wall. Holding the top of the 45-foot tall and 40-foot wide wall was vital. The German barricades faced east on top of the wall, and 400 yards west were the west-facing American positions. The Chinese advanced toward both positions by building barricades even closer. "The men all feel that they are in a trap," said the American commander, Captain John T. Myers, "and simply await the hour of execution." On 30th June, the Chinese forced the Germans off the wall, leaving the American Marines alone in its defense. At the same time, a Chinese barricade was advanced within a few feet of the American position, and it became clear that the Americans had to abandon the wall or force the Chinese to retreat. At 2 a.m. on 3rd July, 56 British, Russian, and American Marines and sailors, under the command of Myers, launched an assault against the Chinese barricade on the wall. The attack caught the Chinese sleeping, killed about 20 of them, and expelled the rest of them from the barricades. The Chinese did not attempt to advance their positions on the Tartar wall for the remainder of the siege. Sir Claude MacDonald said 13th July was the most harassing day of the siege. The Japanese and Italians in the Fu were driven back to their last defense line. The Chinese detonated a mine beneath the French legation, pushing the French and Austrians out of most of the French legation. On 16th July, the most capable British officer was killed, and the journalist George Ernest Morrison was wounded. But American Minister Edwin Hurd Conger established contact with the Chinese government, and on 17th July, an armistice was declared by the Chinese. More than 40% of the legation guards were dead or wounded. The motivation of the Chinese was probably the realization that an Allied force of 20,000 men had landed in China, and retribution for the siege was at hand. Officials and commanders at cross purposes. The Manchu general Ronglu concluded that it was futile to fight all of the powers simultaneously, and declined to press home the siege. The Manchu Shaye, Prince Duan, an anti-foreign friend of Dong Fuxiang, wanted artillery for Dong's troops to destroy the legations. Ronglu blocked the transfer of artillery to Zaiyi and Dong, preventing them from attacking. Ronglu forced Dong Fuxiang and his troops to pull back from completing the siege and destroying the legations, thereby saving the foreigners and making diplomatic concessions. Ronglu and Prince King sent food to the legations and used their Manchu bannermen to attack the Muslim Gansu braves in the spelling of the time of Dong Fuxiang and the Boxers who were besieging the foreigners. They issued edicts ordering the foreigners to be protected, but the Gansu warriors ignored it and fought against bannermen, who tried to force them away from the legations. The Boxers also took commands from Dong Fuxiang. Ronglu also deliberately hid an imperial decree from General Ni Shixiang. The decree ordered him to stop fighting the Boxers because of the foreign invasion, and also because the population was suffering. Due to Ronglu's actions, General Ni continued to fight the Boxers and killed many of them, even as the foreign troops were making their way to China. Ronglu also ordered Ni to protect foreigners and save the railway from the Boxers. Because parts of the railway were saved under Ronglu's orders, the foreign invasion army was able to transport itself into China quickly. General Ni committed thousands of troops against the Boxers instead of against the foreigners. Ni was already outnumbered by the Allies by 4,000 men. General Ni was blamed for attacking the Boxers, as Ronglu let Ni take all the blame. At the Battle of Tianjin, or Tianjin, General Ni decided to sacrifice his life by walking into the range of Allied guns. Zhu Jingsheng, who had served as the king envoy to many of the same states under siege in the legation quarter, argued that the evasion of extraterritorial rights and the killing of foreign diplomats are unprecedented in China and abroad. Zhu and 5 other officials urged Empress Dowager Cixi to order the repression of Boxers, the execution of their leaders, and a diplomatic settlement with foreign armies. The Empress Dowagers, outraged, sentenced Zhu and 5 others to death for willfully and absurdly petitioning the imperial court. and building subversive thought. They were executed on 28th July 1900, and their severed heads were placed on display at Kashiku execution grounds in Beijing. Reflecting this vacillation, some Chinese soldiers were quite liberally firing at foreigners under siege from its very onset. Shishi did not personally order imperial troops to conduct a siege, and on the contrary had ordered them to protect the foreigners in the legations. Prince Yuan led the Boxers to loot his enemies within the imperial court, and the foreigners, although imperial authorities expelled Boxers after they were led into the city, and went on a looting rampage against both the foreign and the King imperial forces. Older Boxers were sent outside Beijing to halt the approach of foreign armies, while younger men were absorbed into the Muslim Gansu army. With conflicting allegiances and priorities motivating the various forces inside Beijing, the situation in the city became increasingly confused. The foreign legations continued to be surrounded by both King emperors and Gansu forces, while Dong Fuxiang's Gansu army, now swollen by the addition of the Boxers, wished to press the siege. Ronglu's imperial forces seem to have largely attempted to follow Empress Dowager Cici's decree to protect the legations. However, to satisfy the conservatives in the imperial court, Ronglu's men also fired on the legations and let off firecrackers to give the impression that they too were attacking the foreigners. Inside the legations and out of communication with the foreign world, the foreigners simply fired on any targets that presented themselves, including messengers from the imperial court, civilians and besiegers of all persuasions. Dong Fuxiang was denied artillery held by Ronglu, which stopped him from leveling the legations, and when he complained to Empress Dowager Cici on 23rd June, she dismissively said that, quote, "Your tail is becoming too heavy to wag." The alliance discovered large amounts of unused Chinese Krupp artillery and shells after the siege was lifted. The armistice, though occasionally broken, endured until 13th August when an Allied army led by the British Alfred Gassely, approaching Beijing to relieve the siege, the Chinese launched their heaviest fusillade on the legation quarter. As the foreign army approached, Chinese forces melted away. Gassely expedition. Foreign navies started building up their presence along the northern China coast from the end of April 1900. Several international forces were sent to the capital with varying success, and the Chinese forces were ultimately defeated by the eight-nation alliance of Austria-Hungary, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia, and the United Kingdom, and the United States. Independent of the alliance, the Netherlands dispatched 3 cruisers in July to protect its citizens in Shanghai. British Lieutenant General Alfred Gassely acted as the commanding officer of the eight-nation alliance, which eventually numbered 55,000. The main contingent was composed of Japanese, Russian, British, French, U.S., German, Italian, Austro-Hungarian, and anti-Boxer Chinese troops in that order. The 1st Chinese Regiment, or the Weihawei Regiment, which was praised for its performance, consisted of Chinese collaborators serving in the British military. Notable events included the seizure of the Dagu forts, commanding the approaches to Tianjin, and the boarding and capture of 4 Chinese destroyers by British commander Roger Keyes. Among the foreigners besieged in Tianjin was a young American mining engineer named Herbert Hoover, who would go on to become the 31st President of the United States. The international force finally captured Tianjin on 14th July. The international force suffered its heaviest casualties in the Boxer Rebellion in the Battle of Tianjin. With Tianjin as a base, the international force marched from Tianjin to Beijing, about 120 kilometers, with 20,000 Allied troops. On 4th August, there were approximately 70,000 King Imperial troops and anywhere from 50 to 100,000 Boxers along the way. The Allies only encountered minor resistance, fighting battles at Bikang and Yangkun. At Yangkun, the 14th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. and British troops led the assault. The weather was a major obstacle. Conditions were extremely humid, with temperatures sometimes reaching 42 degrees Celsius. These high temperatures and insects plagued the Allies. Soldiers became dehydrated and horses died. Chinese villagers killed Allied troops who searched for the wells. The heat killed Allied soldiers who foamed at the mouth. The tactics along the way were gruesome on either side. Allied soldiers beheaded already dead Chinese corpses, bayoneted or beheaded live Chinese civilians, and raped Chinese girls and women. Cossacks were reported to have killed Chinese civilians almost automatically, and Japanese kicked a Chinese soldier to death. The Chinese responded to the alliance's atrocities with similar acts of violence and cruelty, especially toward captured Russians. Lieutenant Smedley Butler saw the remains of 2 Japanese soldiers nailed to a wall, who had their tongues cut off and their eyes gouged. Lieutenant Butler was wounded during the expedition in the leg and the chest, later receiving the Brevet Medal in recognition for his actions. The international force reached Beijing on 14th August. Following the defeat of the Biang Army in the First Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese government had invested heavily in modernizing the Imperial Army, which was equipped with the modern Mauser repeater rifles and Krupp artillery. Three modernized divisions, consisting of Manchu bannermen, protected the Beijing metropolitan region. Two of them were under the command of anti-Boxer Prince King and Rong Lu, while the anti-foreign Prince Yuan commanded the 10,000-strong Hushenying, or Tiger Spirit Division, which had joined the Gansu Braves and Boxers in attacking the foreigners. It was a Hushenying captain who assassinated the German diplomat Kettler. The tenacious army under Ni Shisheng received Western-style training under German and Russian officers in addition to their modernized weapons and uniforms. They effectively resisted the Alliance at the Battle of Tientsin before retreating and astounded the Alliance forces with the accuracy of their artillery during the siege of the Tianjin concessions. The artillery shells failed to explode upon impact due to corrupt manufacturing. The Gansu Braves under Dong Fuxiang, which some sources described as ill-disciplined, were armed with modern weapons, but were not trained according to Western drill and wore traditional Chinese uniforms. They led the defeat of the Alliance at Langfang in the Seymour expedition and were the most ferocious in besieging the legations in Beijing. Some banner forces were given modernized weapons and Western training, and becoming the Metropolitan Banner Forces, which were decimated in the fighting. Among the Manchu dead was the father of the writer Lao She. The British won the race among the international forces to be first to reach the besieged legation quarter. The U.S. was able to play a role due to the presence of U.S. ships and troops stationed in Manila since the U.S. conquest of the Philippines during the Spanish-American War and the subsequent Philippine-American War. In the U.S. military, the action in the Boxer Rebellion was known as the China Relief Expedition. The United States Marines scaling the walls of Beijing is an iconic image of the Boxer Rebellion. The British Army reached the legation quarter on the afternoon of 14th August and relieved the legation quarter. The Biatang was relieved on 16th August, first by Japanese soldiers and then officially by the French. Evacuation of the Qing Imperial Court from Beijing to Xi'an. In the early hours of 15th August, just as the foreign legations were being relieved, Empress Dowager Cixi, dressed in the padded blue cotton of a farm woman, the Gongshu Emperor, and a small retinue climbed into 3 wooden oxen carts and escaped from the city covered with rough blankets. Legend has it that the Empress Dowager was then either ordered that the Guangxu Emperor's favorite concubine, consort Zhen, be thrown down a well in the Forbidden City, or tricked her into drowning herself. The journey was made all the more arduous by the lack of preparation, but that the Empress Dowager insisted that this was not a retreat, but rather a tour of inspection. After weeks of travel, the party arrived in Xi'an and Shanxi province, beyond protective mountain passes where the foreigners could not reach, deep in Chinese Muslim territory and protected by the Gansu Braves. The foreigners had no orders to pursue the Empress Dowager, so they decided to stay put. Russian invasion of Manchuria. The Russian Empire and the Qing Empire had maintained a long peace, starting with the Treaty of Nershinsk in 1689, but Tsarist forces took advantage of the Chinese defeats to impose the Agun Treaty of 1858 and the Treaty of Peking in 1860, which ceded formerly Chinese territory in Manchuria to Russia, much of which is held by Russia to the present day, Primorye. The Russians aimed for control over the Amur River for navigation, and the all-weather ports of Jiaren and Port Arthur in the Liaodong Peninsula. The rise of Japan as an Asian power provoked Russia's anxiety, especially in light of expanding Japanese influence in Korea. Following Japan's victory in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1895, the triple intervention of Russia, Germany, and France forced Japan to return the territory won in Liaodong, leading to a de facto Sino-Russian alliance. Local Chinese in Manchuria were incensed at these Russian advances and began to harass Russians and Russian institutions, such as the Chinese Eastern Railway. In June 1900, the Chinese bombarded the town of Blagoroveshchensk on the Russian side of the Amur. The Tsar's government, the Tsar's government used the pretext of the Boxer activity to move some 200,000 troops into the area to crush the Boxers. The Chinese used arson to destroy a bridge carrying a railway and barracks on 27th July. The Boxers destroyed railways and cut lines for telegraphs, and burned the Yantai mines. By 21st September, Russian troops took Yilin, and Liaodong province, and by the end of the month completely occupied Manchuria, where their presence was a major factor leading to the Russo-Japanese War. The Chinese Honghuzi bandits of Manchuria, who had fought alongside the Boxers in the war, did not stop when the Boxer Rebellion was over, and continued guerrilla warfare against the Russian occupation up to the Russo-Japanese War, when the Russians were defeated by Japan. Massacre of missionaries and Chinese Christians. Orthodox Protestant and Catholic missionaries and some of their Chinese parishioners were massacred throughout northern China, some by Boxers and others by the government troops and authorities. After the declaration of war on Western powers in June 1900, Yu Xian, who had been named governor of Shanxi in March that year, implemented a brutal anti-foreign and anti-Christian policy. On 9th July, reports circulated that he had executed 44 foreigners, including women and children from missionary families, whom he had invited to the provincial capital, Qiyuan, under the promise to protect them. Although the purported eyewitness accounts have recently been questioned as improbable, this event became a notorious symbol of Chinese anger, known as the Qianyuan Massacre. By the summer's end, more foreigners and as many as 2,000 Chinese Christians had been put to death in the province. Journalist and historical writer Nat Brandt has called the massacre of Christians in Shanxi the greatest single tragedy in the history of Christian evangelicalism. During the Boxer Rebellion as a whole, a total of 136 Protestant missionaries and 53 children were killed, and 47 Catholic priests and nuns. 30,000 Chinese Catholics, 2,000 Chinese Protestants, and 200 to 400 of the 700 Russian Orthodox Christians in Beijing were estimated to have been killed. Collectively, the Protestant dead were called the China Martyrs of 1900. 222 Russian Christian Chinese martyrs, including Saint Metrophanes, were locally canonized as new martyrs on 22nd April 1902 after Archimandrite Innocent Fugurovsky, head of the Russian Orthodox Mission in China, solicited the Most Holy Synod to perpetuate their memory. This was the first local canonization for more than 2 centuries. The Boxers went on to murder Christians across 26 prefectures. This can be seen in the context of Christianity and colonialism. Aftermath. Occupation, looting, and atrocities. Beijing, Tianjin, and other cities in northern China were occupied for more than 1 year by the International Expeditionary Force, under the command of German General Alfred Graf von Waldersee. Atrocities by foreign troops were common. French troops ravaged the countryside around Beijing on behalf of Chinese Catholics. The Americans and British paid General Yuan Shikai and his army, the Right Division, to help the Eight-Nation Alliance suppress the Boxers. Yuan Shikai's forces killed tens of thousands of people in their anti-Boxer campaign in Shili Province and Shandong after the Alliance captured Beijing. Yuan operated out of the Baoding during the campaign, which ended in 1902. Li Hongsang commanded the Chinese soldiers to kill the Boxers to assist the Alliance. From contemporary Western observers, German, Russian, and Japanese troops received the greatest criticism for their ruthlessness and willingness to wantonly execute Chinese of all ages and backgrounds, sometimes burning and killing entire village populations. The German force arrived too late to take part in the fighting, but undertook punitive expeditions to villages in the countryside. Kaiser Wilhelm II, on 27 July, during departure ceremonies for the German relief force, included an impromptu but intemperate reference to the Hun invaders of continental Europe, which would later be resurrected by British propaganda to mock Germany during the First World War and the Second World War. Quote, "Should you encounter the enemy, he will be defeated. No quarter will be given. Prisoners will not be taken. Whoever falls into your hands is forfeited. Just as a thousand years ago, the Huns, under their king Attila, made a name for themselves, one that even today makes them seem mighty in history and legend. May the name German be affirmed by you in such a way in China that no Chinese will ever dare to look cross-eyed at a German." One newspaper called the aftermath of the siege a carnival of ancient loot, and others called it looting by soldiers, civilians, and missionaries. These characterizations called to mind the sacking of the Summer Palace in 1860. Each nationality accused others of being the worst looters. An American diplomat, Herbert G. Squires, filled several railroad cars with loot and artifacts. The British legation held loot auctions every afternoon and proclaimed, "Looting on the part of British troops was carried out in the most orderly manner." However, one British officer noted, "It is one of the unwritten laws of war that a city which does not surrender at the last and is taken by storm is looted." For the rest of 1900 to 1901, the British held loot auctions every day except Sunday in front of the main gate to the British legation. Many foreigners, including Sir Claude Maxwell MacDonald and Lady Ethel MacDonald and George Ernest Morrison of the Times, were active bidders among the crowd. Many of these looted items ended up in Europe. The Catholic Beitang, or Northern Cathedral, was a sales room for stolen property. The American Commander General Adna Shafi banned looting by American soldiers, but the ban was ineffectual. Some, but by no means all, Western missionaries took an active part in calling for retribution. To provide restitution to missionaries and Chinese Christian families whose property had been destroyed, William Ament, a missionary of American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, guided American troops through villages to punish those he suspected of being Boxers and confiscate their property. When Mark Twain read of this expedition, he wrote a scathing essay, "To the Person Sitting in Darkness," that attacked the reverend bandits of the American Board, especially targeting Ament, one of the most respected missionaries in China. The controversy was front-page news during much of 1901. Ament's counterpart on the distaff side was doughty British missionary Georgina Smith, who presided over a neighborhood in Beijing as judge and jury. While one historical account reported that Japanese troops were astonished by other alliance troops raping civilians, others noticed that Japanese troops were looting and burning without mercy, and that Chinese women and girls by hundreds have committed suicide to escape the worst fate at the hands of Russian and Japanese brutes. Roger Keyes, who commanded the British destroyer Fame and accompanied the Gasly expedition, noted that the Japanese had brought their own regimental wives to the front to keep their soldiers from raping Chinese civilians. The Daily Telegraph journalist E.J. Dillon stated that he witnessed the mutilated corpses of Chinese women who were raped and killed by the Alliance troops. The French commander dismissed the rapes, attributing them to the gallantry of the French soldier. A foreign journalist, George Lynch, said that there are things that I must not write, and that may not be printed in England, which would seem to show that this Western civilization of ours is merely a veneer over savagery. Many bannermen supported the Boxers and shared their anti-foreign sentiment. The German minister Clemens von Kettler was assassinated by a Manchu. Bannermen had been devastated in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895, and banner armies were destroyed while resisting the invasion. In the words of historian Pamela Crossley, their living conditions went from desperate poverty to true misery. When thousands of Manchus fled south from Agun during the fighting in 1900, their cattle and horses were stolen by Russian Cossacks, who then burned their villages and homes to ashes. The clan system of the Manchus in Agun was obliterated by the despoliation of that area at the hands of the Russians. Under the lead of some highly ranked officials, including Li Hongshang and Yuan Shikai and Zhang Shidong, several provinces in the southeast formed the Southeast Mutual Protection during this period to avoid further expansion of the chaos. These provinces claimed to be neutral and refused to fight either the Boxers or the Eight Nations Alliance. Reparations. After the capture of Peking by the foreign armies, some of Empress Dowager Cici's advisors advocated that the war be carried on, arguing that China could have defeated the foreigners, as it was disloyal and traitorous people within China who were allowing Beijing and Tianjin to be captured by the Allies, and that the interior of China was impenetrable. They also recommended that Zhang Fuxiang continue fighting. The Empress Dowager Cici was practical, however, and decided that the terms were generous enough for her to acquiesce when she was assured of her continued reign after the war, and that China would not be forced to cede any territory. On 7 September 1901, the Qing Imperial Court agreed to sign the Boxer Protocol, also known as the Peace Agreement between the Eight-Nation Alliance and China. The protocol ordered the execution of 10 high-ranking officials linked to the outbreak and other officials who were found guilty of the slaughter of foreigners in China. Alphonse Mumm, Freiherr von Schwarzenstein, Ernest Sato, and Komura Jutaro signed on behalf of Germany, Britain, and Japan, respectively. China was fined war reparations of 450 million taels of fine silver, or around 540 million troy ounces, for the loss that it caused. The reparation was to be paid by 1940, within 39 years, and would be about 982 million taels with interest, 4% per year included. To help meet the payment, it was agreed to increase the existing tariff from an actual 3.18 to 5%, and to tax hitherto duty-free merchandise. The sum of reparation was estimated by the Chinese population, roughly 450 million, in 1900, to let each Chinese pay 1 tael. Chinese custom income and salt tax was enlisted as a guarantee of their reparation. China paid 668 million taels of silver from 1901 to 1939, equivalent in 2010 to US $61 billion on a purchasing power parity basis. Which I would add, you shouldn't convert it on a purchasing power parity basis. You should convert it to US dollars, or as a percent of the economy. But moving forward, a large portion of the reparations paid to the United States was diverted to pay for the education of Chinese students in U.S. universities under the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship Program. To prepare the students chosen for this program, an institute was established to teach the English language and to serve as a preparatory school. When the first of these students returned to China, they undertook the teaching of the subsequent students, and from this institute was born Tsinghua University. Some of the reparation due to Britain was later earmarked for a similar program. The China Inland Mission lost more members than any other missionary agency. 58 adults and 21 children were killed. However, in 1901, when the Allied nations were demanding compensation from the Chinese government, Hudson Taylor refused to accept payment for the loss of property or life in order to demonstrate the meekness and gentleness of Christ to the Chinese. The Belgian Catholic vicar apostolic of Ordos, Messenger Alphonse Burmine, wanted foreign troops garrisoned in Inner Mongolia, but the governor refused. Burmine petitioned the Manchu and Ming to send troops to Hetao, where Prince Duan's Mongol troops and General Dong Fuxiang's Muslim troops allegedly threatened Catholics. It turned out that Burmine had created this incident as a hoax. The Qing government did not capitulate to all the foreign demands. The Manchu governor Yu Xian was executed, but the imperial court refused to execute the Han Chinese General Dong Fuxiang, although he had encouraged the killing of foreigners during the rebellion. Empress Dowager Cixi intervened when the alliance demanded him executed, and Dong was only cashiered and sent back home. Instead, Dong lived a life of luxury and power in exile in his home province of Gansu. Upon Dong's death in 1908, all honors which had been stripped from him were restored, and he was given the full military burial. Long-term consequences. The European great powers finally ceased their ambitions of colonizing China, since they had learned from the Boxer rebellions that the best way to deal with China was through the ruling dynasty rather than directly with the Chinese people, a sentiment embodied in the adage, "The people are afraid of officials, the officials are afraid of foreigners, and the foreigners are afraid of the people." And they even briefly assisted the king in their war against the Japanese to prevent Japanese domination in the region. Concurrently, the period marks the ceding of the European great powers' interference in Chinese affairs, with the Japanese replacing the Europeans as the dominant power for their lopsided involvement in the war against the Boxers, as well as their victory in the First Sino-Japanese War. With the toppling of the king that followed and the rise of the nationalist Kuomintang, European sway in China was reduced to a symbolic status. After taking Manchuria in 1905, Japan came to dominate Asian affairs militarily and culturally, with many of the Chinese scholars also educated in Japan, the most prominent example being Sun Yat-sen, who would later found the nationalist Kuomintang in China. In October 1900, Russia occupied the provinces of Manchuria, a move that threatened the Anglo-American hopes of maintaining the country's openness to commerce under the open door policy. Japan's clash with Russia over Liaodong and other provinces in eastern Manchuria because of Russian refusal to honor the terms of the Boxer Protocol that called for their withdrawal led to the Russo-Japanese War, when 2 years of negotiations broke down in February 1904. The Russian lease of Liaodong, 1898, was confirmed. Russia was ultimately defeated by an increasingly confident Japan. Besides the compensation, Empress Dowager Cixi reluctantly started some reforms, despite her previous views. Known as the New Policies, which started in 1901, the imperial examination system for government service was eliminated, and the system of education through Chinese classics was replaced with a European liberal system that led to a university degree. Along with the formation of new military and police organizations, the reforms also simplified the central bureaucracy and made a start at revamping taxation policies. After the death of Cixi and the Guangxu Emperor in 1908, the Prince Regent Xiaofeng, Prince Chun, the Guangxu Emperor's brother, launched further reforms. The effect on China was a weakening of the dynasty and its national defense capabilities. The government structure was temporarily sustained by the Europeans. Behind the international conflict, internal ideological differences between northern Chinese and anti-foreign royalists and southern Chinese and anti-king revolutionists were further deepened. The scenario in the last years of the Qing dynasty gradually escalated into a chaotic warlord era in which the most powerful northern warlords were hostile toward the southern revolutionaries, who overthrew the Qing monarchy in 1911. The rivalry was not fully resolved until the northern warlords were defeated by the Kuomintang in Kuomintang's 1926-28 northern expedition. Prior to the final defeat of the Boxer Rebellion, all anti-king movements in the previous century, such as the Taiping Rebellion, had been successfully suppressed by the king. The historian Walter Lefebvre has argued that President William McKinley's decision to send 5,000 American troops to quell rebellion marks the origins of modern presidential war powers. McKinley took a historic step in creating a new 20th century presidential power. He dispatched the 5,000 troops without consulting Congress, let alone obtaining a declaration of war, to fight the Boxers who were supported by the Chinese government. Presidents had previously used such force against non-governmental groups that threatened U.S. interests and citizens. It was now used, however, against recognized governments, and without obeying the Constitution's provisions about who was to declare war. Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., concurred and wrote, "The intervention in China marked the start of a crucial shift in the presidential employment of armed force overseas. In the 19th century, military force committed without congressional authorization had been typically used against non-governmental organizations. Now it was beginning to be used against sovereign states, and in the case of Theodore Roosevelt, with less consultation than ever. In the Second Sino-Japanese War, when the Japanese asked the Muslim general Ma Hongqi to defect and become a head of a Muslim puppet state, he responded that his relatives had been killed during the Battle of Peking, including his uncle Ma Fulu. Since Japanese troops made up most of the Allied forces, there would be no cooperation with the Japanese." Controversies and changing views of the Boxers. From the beginning, views differed as to whether the Boxers were better seen as anti-imperialist, patriotic, and proto-nationalist, or as uncivilized, irrational, and futile opponents of inevitable change. The historian Joseph Escherich comments that the confusion about the Boxer Uprising is not simply a matter of popular misconceptions, since there is no major incident in China's modern history on which the range of professional interpretation is as great. Chinese liberals such as Hu Shi often condemned the Boxers for their irrationality and barbarity. Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the founding father of the Republic of China and of the nationalists, at first believed that the Boxer movement had been stirred up by the Qing government's rumors, which caused confusion among the populace and delivered scathing criticism of the Boxers' anti-foreignism and obscurantism. Sun praised the Boxers for their spirit of resistance, but called them bandits. Students shared an ambivalent attitude to the Boxers and stated that while the uprising originated from the ignorant and stubborn people of the interior areas, their beliefs were brave and righteous, and could be transformed into a moving force for independence. After the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, nationalist Chinese became more sympathetic to the Boxers. In 1918, Sun praised their fighting spirit, and said that the Boxers were courageous and fearless in fighting to the death against the Alliance armies, specifically at the Battle of Yangkun. The leaders of the New Culture movement, Chen Juxiu, forgave the barbarism of the Boxer given the crime foreigners committed in China, and contended it was those subservient to the foreigners that truly deserved our resentment. In other countries, views of the Boxers were complex and contentious. Mark Twain said that the Boxer is a patriot. He loves his country better than he does the countries of other people. I wish him success. The Russian writer Leo Tolstoy also praised the Boxers and accused Nicholas II of Russia and Wilhelm II of Germany of being chiefly responsible for the lootings, rapes, murders, and the Christian brutality of the Russian and Western troops. The Russian revolutionary Vladimir Lenin mocked the Russian government's claim that it was protecting Christian civilization. Quote, "Poor imperial government, so Christianly unselfish, and yet so unjustly maligned. Several years ago, it unselfishly seized Port Arthur, and now it is unselfishly seizing Manchuria. It has unselfishly flooded the frontier provinces of China with hordes of contractors, engineers, and officers who, by their conduct, have roused to indignation even the Chinese known for their docility. The Indian Bengali Rabindranath Tagore attacked the European colonists. A number of Indian soldiers in the British Indian Army agreed that the Boxers were right, and that the British stole from the Temple of Heaven a bell, which was given back to China by the Indian military in 1994. Even some American churchmen spoke out in support of the Boxers. The evangelist, Reverend Dr. George F. Pentecost, said that the Boxer uprising was a patriotic movement to expel the foreign devils. Just that, the foreign devils. Suppose, he said, the great nations of Europe were to put their fleets together, come over here, seize Portland, move down to Boston, then New York, then Philadelphia, and so on, down the Atlantic coast and around the Gulf of Galveston. Suppose they took possession of these port cities, drove our people into the hinterland, built great warehouses and factories, brought in a body of dissolute agents, and calmly notified our people that henceforward they would manage the commerce of the country. Would we not have a Boxer movement to drive those foreign European Christian devils out of our country? The Russian newspaper, Amorsky Krai, criticized the killing of innocent civilians and charged that restraint, civilization, and culture instead of racial hatred and destruction would have been more becoming of a civilized Christian nation. The paper asked, "What shall we tell civilized people? We shall have to tell them, do not consider us as brothers anymore. We are mean and terrible people. We have killed those who hid at our place, who sought our protection." The events also left a longer impact. The historian Robert Bickers found that for the British in China, the Boxer Rising served as the equivalent of the Indian Mutiny, and came to represent the Yellow Peril. Later events, he adds, such as the Chinese Nationalist Revolution in the 1920s, and even the activities of the Red Guards of the 1960s, were perceived as being in the shadow of the Boxers. In Taiwan and Hong Kong, history textbooks often present the Boxer as irrational, but in the People's Republic of China, government textbooks describe the Boxer movement as anti-imperialist, patriotic peasant movement that failed by the lack of leadership from the modern working class, and they describe the International Army as an invading force. In recent decades, however, large-scale projects of village interviews and explorations of archival sources have led our historians in China to take a more nuanced view. Some non-Chinese scholars, such as Joseph Escherich, have seen the movement as anti-imperialist, but others hold that the corrupt nationalistic is anachronistic because the Chinese nation had not yet been formed, and the Boxers were more concerned with regional issues. Paul Cohen's recent study includes a survey of the Boxers as myth, which shows how their memory was used in changing ways in 20th century China, from the New Culture movement to the Cultural Revolution. In recent years, the Boxer question has been debated in the People's Republic of China. In 1998, the critical scholar Wang Yi argued that the Boxers had features in common with the extremism of the Cultural Revolution. Both events had the external goal of liquidating all harmful pests, with the domestic goal of eliminating bad elements of all descriptions, and the relation was rooted in cultural obscurantism. Wang explained to his readers the changes in attitudes toward the Boxers, from the condemnation of the May 4th movement to the approval expressed by Mao Zedong during the Cultural Revolution. In 2006, Yuan Wuxi, a professor of philosophy at Songshan University in Guangzhou, wrote that the Boxers, by their criminal actions, brought unspeakable suffering to the nation and its people. These are all facts that everybody knows, and it is a national shame that the Chinese people cannot forget. Yuan charged that the history textbooks had been lacking in neutrality by presenting the Boxer uprising as a magnificent feat of patriotism, and not the view that most Boxer rebels were violent. In response, some labeled Yuan Wuxi a traitor, Han Xiang. Terminology. The first reports coming from China in 1898 referred to the village activists as Yihiquan. The first known use of the term Boxer was September 1899, in a letter from missionary Grace Newton in Shandong. It appears from the context that Boxer was a known term at that time, possibly coined by the Shandong missionaries Arthur H. Smith and Henry Porter. Smith says in his book of 1902 that the name Le Ho Xuan literally denotes the fists, Xuan, of righteousness or public harmony, Ho, in an apparent allusion to the strength of the united force which was to be put forth. As the Chinese phrase fists and feet signifies boxing and wrestling, there appeared to be no more suitable term for the adherents of the sect than Boxers, a designation first used by one or two missionary correspondents of foreign journals in China, and later universally accepted on account of the difficulty of coining a better one. On 6 June 1900, the Times of London used the term rebellion in quotation marks, presumably to indicate their view that the rising was in fact instigated by Empress Dowager Cixi. The historian Lan Xinxiang refers to the so-called Boxer Rebellion and explains that, quote, while peasant rebellion was nothing new in Chinese history, a war against the world's most powerful states was. The name Boxer Rebellion, concludes Joseph Escherich, another recent historian, is truly a misnomer, for the Boxers never rebelled against the Manchu rulers of China and their Qing dynasty, and the most common Boxer slogan throughout the history of the movement was, support the king, destroy the foreign. He adds that only after the movement was suppressed by the Allied intervention did both the foreign powers and influential Chinese officials realize that the king would have to remain as government of China in order to maintain order and collect taxes to pay the indemnity. Therefore, in order to save face for the Empress Dowager and the imperial court, the argument was made that the Boxers were rebels, and that the support from the imperial court came only from a few Manchu princes. Escherich concludes that the origin of the term rebellion was purely political and opportunistic, but it has shown a remarkable staying power, particularly in popular accounts. Other recent Western works refer to the Boxer movement, Boxer War or Yihituan Movement, while Chinese studies use Yihituan Yundong, that is, Yihituan Movement. In his discussion of the general and legal implications of the terminology involved, the German scholar Thoralf Klein notes that all of the terms, including the Chinese ones, are posthumous interpretations of the conflict. He argues that each term, whether it be uprising, rebellion, or movement, implies a different definition of the conflict. Even the term Boxer War, which has become widely used by recent scholars in the West, raises questions, as war was never declared, and Allied troops behaved as a punitive expedition in colonial style, not a declared war with legal constraints. The Allies took advantage of the fact that China had not signed the laws and customs of war on land, a key document at the 1899 Hague Peace Conference. They argued that China had violated its provisions, but themselves ignored them. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like, follow, comment, or subscribe. Thanks for watching.